On September 1, 1985, the research vessel R.V. Knorr from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution was searching for something in the North Atlantic. Commander Professor Ballard was glued to the screen as an underwater robot advanced step by step. Suddenly, when the boiler on the seabed came into view, the entire crew erupted with excitement. They had found the wreck of the Titanic. The Titanic, which sank in 1912, had been lost for 73 years. It's arguably the most famous ship in the world, with its story known across nations. But how much do we really know about the whole story? The events depicted in the movie are just the tip of the iceberg. Why do some people, including Elon Musk, claim that the Titanic never actually sank?
So the Titanic allegedly never sunk. Everyone knows the story of the Titanic hitting an iceberg in 1912, but what if I told you it never sunk?
Why was there a mysterious ship 37 kilometers away, silently watching the tragedy unfold without offering help? Why do others believe the Titanic's sinking was a series of coincidences or even a curse? And most importantly, what exactly caused the Titanic to go down? Today we're diving into these 5 fascinating mysteries surrounding the Titanic. Let's travel back to 1995. Robin Gardner, a researcher from Oxford, England, made a statement that shook the world. The Titanic never sank. This groundbreaking claim left everyone asking, if it didn't sink, then what was the wreckage found at the bottom of the North Atlantic? And what happened to the 1,500 passengers who lost their lives that night? With his new book in hand, Robin calmly presented an extraordinary theory. To understand it, he explained, we first need to go back to the 19th century, when 2 major shipping companies were in fierce competition: White Star Line and Cunard Line. White Star, based in Liverpool, and Cunard from Southampton, were battling to dominate the transatlantic shipping market. By the 1900s, this rivalry had reached its peak. Cunard focused on innovation, creating luxury liners named after British royalty, like Queen Mary II, Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Victoria. In 1906, they launched the Lusitania and Mauretania, the largest and fastest ships on the North Atlantic at the time. White Star, however, struggled to keep up. Determined to fight back, White Star partnered with the American IMM Group for financial backing and came up with an ambitious plan: to build 3 massive, luxurious ocean liners that would outclass Cunard in every way. These ships would be faster, larger, and more opulent than anything the world had seen. They were named Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Let's take the Titanic as an example. This engineering marvel had 11 decks, measured 269 meters long, 28.3 meters wide, and 53.3 meters high. Newspapers at the time printed cross-sections of the ship, comparing it to skyscrapers and traditional passenger vessels. It was a true floating city. The Titanic's interiors were just as awe-inspiring. With crystal chandeliers, stained glass, intricately carved furniture, and 2 grand spiral staircases, its first-class accommodations rivaled 5-star hotels. Onboard amenities included a heated swimming pool, a Turkish bath, an electric fountain bath, a gym, a squash court, 4 restaurants, 2 barbershops, 2 beauty salons, and even a library. Most impressive of all was its cutting-edge safety design. The Titanic had 15 watertight compartments, making it virtually unsinkable, or so it was thought. If one compartment floods, it won't impact the ship's ability to navigate. Even with 3 compartments flooded, the power will stay on. And if 4 compartments are completely filled with seawater, this massive ship can still float and wait for rescue. Once White Star announced its ambitious project, the public was captivated. Construction on the Titanic and its sister ships began in Northern Ireland, with the entire world watching closely. In 1910, the first of the White Star Line's trio of superliners, the Olympic, was launched, and the second, the Titanic, was nearing completion and undergoing final renovations. At this point in the story, researcher Robin Gardner presented a striking photograph showing 2 identical giant ships docked side by side. it was nearly impossible to tell them apart. Robin then shared an intriguing account from a survivor of the Titanic, a second-class passenger named Lawrence Beasley. In his memoirs, Billis described the ship as remarkably stable during its voyage. However, he noticed something odd. When looking out of the hanging windows on the right side of the ship, he could see only the sea. Yet on the left side, the view revealed only the sky. No sea at all. Why was this? To explore the mystery further, Robin revealed 46 rivet samples allegedly salvaged from the Titanic's wreckage. He explained that these rivets should have met the industry standard of No. 4 quality steel. However, upon closer inspection, many of the rivets were found to be of inferior No. 3 quality, with some even made of basic iron. Experts went on to analyze the microstructure of these iron rivets, uncovering a honeycomb-like glass structure, an indicator of poor quality materials. Robin argued that this evidence hinted at significant quality issues with the Titanic's construction. These weren't merely examples of corner cutting during the building process. They pointed to deeper structural problems, specifically with the ship's keel. Robin suggested that the uneven views described by Billis, the sea on one side and the sky on the other, were the result of a slight tilt in the ship's hull. This tilt, he proposed, was caused by an imbalance in the keel's structural integrity. But why would the White Star Line, a company with ample cash flow and access to top-tier designers, cut corners on such a groundbreaking project? Robin offered a bold explanation. He pointed to a first-class passenger who made a suspicious move. He cancelled his voyage at the last minute, just one day before the Titanic was set to sail. That passenger was none other than J.P. Morgan, the founder of today's J.P. Morgan Chase and one of the most powerful financial tycoons of his time. Could this sudden change in plans have been connected to deeper issues with the Titanic's construction? Robin believed it wasn't a coincidence. J.P. Morgan wasn't just a first-class passenger who cancelled his voyage on the Titanic at the last minute. He was also the founder of IMM Group, the parent company of White Star Line. Why would he suddenly decide not to board the ship? Could it be because he knew what was about to happen? Robin Gardner dove deeper into this mystery and shifted the focus to the first ship of the trio, the Olympic. Back in May 1911, the Olympic was officially launched and put into service, but its maiden year was anything but smooth. On its third voyage, it collided with a tugboat at the New York dock, damaging its hull and forcing it to return to the UK for repairs. To make matters worse, the Olympic was found fully at fault, and the insurance company refused to pay for the damages. Once repaired, the Olympic returned to service. However, disaster struck again during its fifth voyage. Just after departing the UK, it collided with a British warship outside the dock. This time, the damage was severe. The warship's bow was completely destroyed, and a massive hole was torn in the Olympic's hull. Once again, the Olympic had to return for repairs, and the insurance company still refused to cover the costs, because it is still the Olympic's full responsibility. At the time, the Olympic had cost $7 million to build, equivalent to around $370 million today, and was expected to complete at least 100 round trips to break even. But by this point, it had completed only 5 voyages and required 2 major overhauls. Meanwhile, construction of the Titanic, a $7.5 million investment, was still underway. The financial strain on White Star Line was enormous. On top of that, the Olympic being unable to sail meant the White Star Line had no cash flow. Researcher Robin speculated that by 1912, the White Star Line was already teetering on the edge of financial bankruptcy. It's highly possible that J.P. Morgan, who didn't board the ship, orchestrated a secret plan to save the White Star Line. However, this plan was incredibly cruel. Robin himself emphasized multiple times that this is just a theory. But let's be honest, his speculation isn't without some basis. Before the Titanic set sail, it and the Olympic were docked side by side for 44 days. Photos of the two ships during this time fueled Robin's suspicion. What if the two ships were switched? He proposed that the heavily damaged Olympic was disguised as the Titanic and sent on its doomed maiden voyage. The Titanic, meanwhile, would take the Olympic's place and continue operating under its name. Robin suggested that J.P. Morgan's ultimate goal was to sink the fake Titanic, actually the Olympic, in the North Atlantic, more than 3,800 meters deep. The sinking would allow White Star Line to collect insurance money to offset their financial losses. But what about the 2,000 passengers aboard? Robin speculated that Morgan had a backup plan. Another White Star Line ship, the Californian, was allegedly sent to shadow the Titanic and prepare for a rescue. To convince the crew to carry out such a grim mission, Morgan likely assured them that the passengers would be saved. Interestingly, the Californian's cargo list raised eyebrows. It included a large quantity of cotton and more than 3,500 blankets, a curious amount for a routine voyage. Was it a coincidence or part of Morgan's alleged plan? Robin admitted this theory sounds shocking and emphasized it was just a hypothesis. But the unusual details surrounding the Titanic's final days leave plenty of room for speculation. Could J.P. Morgan have orchestrated the most infamous maritime disaster in history for financial gain? As we all know, the Titanic's tragic story ended with its sinking. What's less discussed, however, is that the Californian, a ship just 37 kilometers away, stood by in eerie silence, ignoring the Titanic's distress flares. Why didn't it intervene? The deeper conspiracy surrounding this event seems unfathomable, but every logical assumption feels valid here. Why were corners cut in building the Titanic? Why was its keel uneven? Robin Gardner's theory suggests it's because the ship was intended as a sacrificial vessel, a damaged ship deliberately sent to its doom for insurance fraud. And why didn't the Californian rescue the passengers? Robin didn't explicitly answer, but his theory raises unsettling questions about who was on board, the doomed vessel. Consider this. Among the victims were some of the wealthiest and most influential people of the time, including John Jacob Astor, the world's richest man, department store magnate, Macy's store founder Isidore Strauss and his wife Ida, banker Benjamin Guggenheim, and many other prominent British and American elites. All were potential competitors of J.P. Morgan. After the Titanic sank, these competitors were gone, and just a year later, Morgan and Rothschild spearheaded the creation of the Federal Reserve, gaining control over U.S. monetary policy and the issuance of the dollar. Robin's theory is undoubtedly bold, but he backed it with fascinating evidence. For instance, the Olympic carried the internal number 400, while the Titanic was marked as 401. However, Robin claimed that many artifacts salvaged from the supposed Titanic wreckage bear the number 400, linking them to the Olympic. Not a single item with the number 401 has been conclusively identified among the wreckage, suggesting that when the switch occurred, any markings of 401 may have been intentionally excluded. The reason is that it is very likely that in order to work and defraud insurance, the number 401 was not printed on the soft furnishings of the Titanic. The passengers at that time were actually riding on the Olympic 400 with the number erased. Robin also highlighted photographic evidence. In photos taken during the construction of the Titanic, the bow featured 14 evenly spaced hanging windows. Yet, in a later image taken after its launch, there were 16 unevenly spaced windows, a design unique to the Olympic. Furthermore, underwater images of the wreck show discrepancies in the bow's structure compared to the original construction photos of the Titanic. Despite these compelling details, Robin's theory faced significant challenges. The most critical piece of counter-evidence was found on the sunken ship's propeller. Photographed on the seabed, the propeller clearly displayed the number 401, confirming its identity as the Titanic. Even Robin acknowledged this in his book, calling it the fatal evidence against his theory. Despite this, doubts have never gone away. Later, a researcher named Andrew Newton released a documentary that revealed even more shocking evidence. At the end of the documentary, an underwater robot captured clear images of the letters M and P etched into the wreckage, markings that unmistakably belong to the Olympic. However, experts working at the shipwreck site have no plans to salvage it. With bacterial erosion taking its toll, experts predict the remains will completely vanish by 2037 at the latest. So, while Robin's theory has been dismissed by the mainstream, it may forever remain an unsolved mystery. When the Titanic sank, the Californian was only 37 kilometers away. So why didn't it rush to the rescue? While Robin's theory offers one perspective, mainstream research suggests a different explanation. According to this view, the story might have unfolded like this. Let's rewind to April 12, 1912, the Titanic's second day at sea. On that day, the ship received its first warning about icebergs. The Titanic was equipped with the cutting-edge Marconi wireless telegraph system, a recent innovation for commercial use. However, this system wasn't under the captain's direct control. Instead, it was managed by the Marconi Telegraph Company, which essentially functioned as a sales department on board. In this setup, the captain was more like a client than the one in charge. The telegraph room was staffed by two operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, whose job was to handle messages for both the ship's operations and its passengers. Their workload was intense. They worked 24-hour shifts, taking turns resting in the telegraph room itself, always ready to jump back into action. On April 12th, the captain received an iceberg warning and anticipated that the year's icebergs were drifting further south than usual. He adjusted the ship's course twice to move further south, but notably, he did not reduce the Titanic's speed, maintaining a brisk 21.5 knots, about 40 kilometers per hour, toward the United States. By April 14th, the telegraph room had received 7 separate iceberg warnings from nearby ships. Common sense would suggest that the captain should have slowed the ship and further adjusted course. Instead, he ignored these warnings and continued at full speed. Why did this happen? According to Robin's theory, the captain deliberately carried out a plan to sink the ship. However, during the accident hearings, an important survivor, J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line at the time, gave critical testimony. This moment was even depicted in the movie Titanic. Witnesses claimed they overheard Ismay and the captain discussing the importance of speed.
The press knows the size of Titanic. Now I want them to marvel at her speed.
Since it was the Titanic's maiden voyage, they wanted to outpace Cunard's ships on the Britain to America route. The goal was to prove that White Star Line could dominate Cunard not only in luxury and comfort, but also in speed. Let's not forget that White Star Line was drowning in debt at the time. The first ship, the Olympic, had already been a failure, and if the second ship, the Titanic, couldn't surpass Cunard, the company would face serious trouble. Under this pressure, the captain took Ismay's advice and prioritized speed over safety. On top of that, everyone was influenced by the hype surrounding the Titanic. The ship was widely promoted as unsinkable, which blinded people to the real risks. On the night of April 14th, the conditions were treacherous. The moonless sky and strong winds made visibility extremely poor. The ship had a lookout tower, but the sailors stationed there couldn't see a thing. Meanwhile, iceberg warning telegrams kept pouring into the telegraph room. The two exhausted operators, already overwhelmed by their workload, repeatedly relayed these warnings to the captain. However, the captain seemed to ignore them, which left the operators increasingly frustrated. That evening was not only dangerous, but also hectic. It was rush hour for passengers sending and receiving telegrams, and the two telegraph operators were overwhelmed trying to keep up with the demand to earn bonuses. Preoccupied with passenger requests, they began ignoring subsequent iceberg warnings. At one point, telegraph operator Jack Phillips, frustrated by the repeated warnings from the Californian, snapped and told them to go away and shut up, saying they were too busy handling passenger messages, including one for someone named Press, likely a passenger on board. When the Californian received this brusque reply at 10:55 p.m., its telegraph operator was equally irritated. He turned off the machine and went to bed. Meanwhile, the Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, had already decided to halt the ship for the night, as they appeared to be surrounded by icebergs, ensuring they wouldn't risk navigating further. Unaware of the imminent danger, the Titanic continued speeding toward the ice field. At 11:39 p.m., the sailor on the watchtower spotted a massive iceberg directly in the ship's path. He rang the bell 3 times and notified the first officer, William Murdoch, and he ordered the ship to turn hard to port. Over the next tense minute, the sailors in the watchtower watched as the massive iceberg crept closer and closer, inch by inch. With silent prayers, they hoped for a miracle, and at the very last moment, it seemed as though the iceberg had passed them by. It was now 11:40 p.m. and relief set in. They thought they had successfully avoided disaster. But just 10 seconds later, the ship trembled with a slight vibration, followed by the dull, grinding sound of the iceberg scraping along the hull. Soon after, the iceberg faded into the distance behind the Titanic. At that moment, most on board still believed all was well. It's okay, they thought. We avoided a direct hit. Nothing serious happened. But in reality, if the Titanic had hit the iceberg head-on, the outcome might have been very different. Interestingly, the last time a ship collided with an iceberg was 33 years earlier. Back then, the Arizona faced a situation strikingly similar to the Titanic's. However, its captain made a bold decision. He ordered a full-speed collision with the iceberg. The result? Although the Arizona's bow was heavily damaged, the ship didn't sink. Instead, it managed to stay afloat and safely return to its home port. This historical example suggests that a head-on collision might have caused less catastrophic damage than what ultimately unfolded with the Titanic. When designing the Titanic, engineers had already considered the possibility of a sudden collision with an iceberg. Like all ships, it was equipped with an anti-collision compartment at the bow. If the ship had struck the iceberg head-on, the damage would have been limited to just 1 or 2 flooded compartments. And as I mentioned earlier, even if 4 compartments were flooded, the Titanic could still stay afloat. However, by attempting to avoid the iceberg, the ship's hull was scraped along its side, leaving a long crack that spanned 5 compartments. This was catastrophic. After the Titanic sailed on for another 20 minutes, the situation became clear. The captain, designer, and senior executives convened for an emergency meeting. The captain ordered the ship to stop immediately, but the designer, in a state of panic, delivered grim news. 5 compartments were breached, and seawater was flooding in at a rate of 400 tons per minute. With 20 minutes already passed, he estimated the ship would sink entirely within the next 2 hours. The captain, experienced and composed, quickly made his way to the telegraph room. Calmly, he relayed the distress message: CQD, 41.46 north latitude, 50.14 west longitude. Without hesitation, the 2 telegraph operators dropped all the passengers' telegrams and began desperately sending out calls for help. Time passed, but no nearby ships responded. Suddenly, operator Jack Phillips remembered something crucial. The International Telegraph Organization had recently introduced a new distress code. Realizing they should use it, Phillips switched to the new signal. And so, history was made. The first ever SOS distress call was sent from the Titanic. 2 minutes later, responses began coming in from surrounding ships. The first to reply was the Carpathia, located about 94 kilometers away. However, due to poor weather conditions and dangerous icebergs in the area, it was estimated that the Carpathia would take at least 3.5 hours to reach the Titanic. Far too late, as the Titanic was estimated to have less than 2 hours left. However, amidst the despair, one of the telegraph operators brought up a glimmer of hope. He mentioned that the Californian should be nearby, yet it hadn't responded. They continued sending messages, pinning their last hope on the Californian. Meanwhile, the captain made the heartbreaking decision to order the abandonment of the ship. What no one knew at the time was that the Californian's telegraph operator, annoyed by an earlier exchange, had turned off his machine and gone to sleep. It wasn't until the next morning, when he turned it back on, that he saw the backlog of distress signals, CQDs and SOS messages flooding in like snowflakes. What's even more shocking is that while chaos unfolded on the Titanic and the crew desperately fired flares for help, the Californian's lighting operator actually saw the signals. But the captain dismissed it. He thought the flares were too low to be distress signals and casually concluded that the Titanic was having a fireworks show. He even instructed everyone to ignore it. Later, scientists suggested that this misunderstanding might have been caused by a mirage effect. The combination of floating ice, cold sea temperatures, and light refraction created an optical illusion. This made the flares, which were supposed to soar high into the sky, appear low and misleading, just like fireworks. Because of this, the Californian missed its chance to rescue everyone, a tragedy that could have been avoided. But it wasn't just the Californian. The Titanic itself was plagued by a series of eerie coincidences that felt almost like a curse. At a later hearing, surviving lookout Frederick Fleet revealed a shocking detail. They didn't have a telescope that night. He admitted that if they'd had one, he could have spotted the iceberg at least 1 minute earlier, a crucial minute that might have been enough to save everyone on board. When the court investigated further to find out why there wasn't a telescope that night, the answer was maddening, something that would make anyone clench their fists in frustration. It turned out that just a day before the Titanic set sail, the captain reshuffled the officer assignments. He transferred the Olympics' chief officer, Henry Wilde, to the Titanic, bumping the original chief officer, William Murdoch, down to first officer, the first officer, Charles Lightoller, to second officer, and leaving the second officer, David Blair, without a position. Furious and frustrated about losing his job, Blair left the ship in a hurry, and in his haste, he accidentally took a set of keys with him. This wasn't just any set of keys, it was the one that unlocked the cabinet containing the binoculars meant for the lookout. Without those binoculars, the watchtower crew was left to rely solely on their eyesight to spot icebergs. Years later, that key was purchased by a Chinese businessman. He is Shen Dongjun, CEO of Tessero China, the largest European jewelry retailer in China, for £78,000 and is now on display in Nanjing. But the coincidences didn't end there. When the captain eventually gave the order to abandon ship, the crew scrambled to organize passengers for the lifeboats. The two lieutenants in charge of the left and right sides approached the captain, asking if women and children should be given priority. By then, the captain was overwhelmed and in a state of mental collapse. He answered in a flat, expressionless tone, "Yes, women and children first."
Sir? Women and children first. Yes.
The fate of the Titanic was sealed. This simple instruction, "women and children first," ended up being tragically misunderstood. The officer on the port side interpreted it as only women and children could board the lifeboats.
Good. For the time being, I shall require only women and children.
While the officer on the starboard side understood it as women and children first, followed by anyone else once they were aboard. This miscommunication had devastating consequences. When the first lifeboat, number 7, was lowered on the starboard side, it carried only 28 people, despite having a capacity for 65, and potentially up to 70 if tightly packed. This inefficiency was repeated across many lifeboats. In total, the Titanic's 16 lifeboats could have saved 990 people. But due to mismanagement and miscommunication, they ended up carrying only 633 passengers, leaving hundreds of lives unnecessarily lost. The second coincidence about the lifeboats is truly baffling. According to the original plan, a full-scale lifeboat drill was scheduled for April 14th. But, for reasons unknown, the captain cancelled it just 5 minutes before it was supposed to happen. Later that evening, as the Titanic faced its fateful moment, passengers and crew, unprepared due to the lack of drills, descended into chaos, scrambling for survival. The third coincidence is even more startling. Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, had instructed the ship's designer to remove a significant number of lifeboats before the Titanic set sail. His reason is to only make the deck appear more spacious and aesthetically pleasing. Convinced that the Titanic was unsinkable, they reduced the lifeboats by 24, which could accommodate 1,560 people, eerily close to the 1,514 lives lost in the tragedy. And here's another twist. The Titanic's fourth smokestack wasn't functional. It was purely for show. Ismay prioritized the ship's appearance over safety, replacing the space that could have held additional lifeboats with a decorative chimney. Amid the chaos as the Titanic was sinking, countless touching stories emerged. One of the most memorable is that of the brave violinist, Henry Hartley. The violin he played that night was no ordinary instrument. It was a deeply personal gift from his fiancée, Maria Robinson, given to him when they got engaged. The violin carried an engraving that read, "For Wallace, on the occasion of our engagement." From Maria. This violin, now a symbol of love and courage, resurfaced over a century later. In 2013, it was auctioned by Henry Aldridge and Sons in the UK, fetching an astounding £900,000, a record-breaking price for a Titanic artifact. Today, it stands as one of the most iconic relics from the tragic voyage, a testament to the enduring human stories behind the disaster. One of the most moving stories from the Titanic tragedy is about an elderly couple who chose to face their fate together. This real-life couple, the Strausses, are often thought to have inspired the love story of Jack and Rose in the movie Titanic. As the founders of Macy's, once the world's largest chain department store, they built an incredible legacy during their 40 years of marriage. The Strausses began as small vendors and worked tirelessly in the United States, eventually becoming some of the wealthiest people of their time. In their later years, they planned to enjoy a peaceful retirement. During the winter before the Titanic disaster, they traveled to Europe for a vacation. Their initial plan was to return to the US on the Olympic in the spring, but due to a strike and an accident involving the ship, their trip was delayed and their tickets were transferred to the Titanic. Their first-class tickets, which cost £442, equivalent to about $140,000 today, secured them luxurious accommodations. They were accompanied by a maid and a manservant. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, witnesses saw the Strausses near lifeboat number 8. Mrs. Strauss and the maid prepared to board the lifeboat, but Mr. Strauss was told he could not join them, as only women and children were allowed. As Mr. Strauss firmly said goodbye to his wife, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Strauss refused to leave him behind. She declared, "We have been married for many years, and I will not go anywhere without you."
We've been together for 40 years, and where you go, I go. Don't argue with me, Isidore. You know it does no good.
Although the husband's body was eventually discovered, the wife's remains were never found. Their children laid them to rest together, and on their tombstones these words were inscribed: "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it." This beautiful line comes from the Old Testament. The ship was moving too fast, the telegraph was turned off, the lifeboats were insufficiently prepared, and the telescope was locked away in a cabinet. These seemingly coincidental factors contributed to the tragedy. But what was the direct cause of the Titanic's sinking? In 2009, Dr. Hooper McCarty's team at Johns Hopkins University provided a reliable answer. Surprisingly, their findings matched the theory proposed by Robin 14 years earlier. The real culprit turned out to be the rivets. Remember the 46 rivet samples that were salvaged? The steel should have been grade 4, but it was actually grade 3. Not only was the quality inferior, but there were some iron rivets with numerous impurities found. Dr. Hooper concluded that these faulty rivets were the main reason the Titanic sank. While the hull's quality was indeed flawed, the cause differed from Robin's theory. Robin speculated that corners were deliberately cut. while Dr. Hooper offered a more logical and scientific explanation. Dr. Hooper's team began by replicating the steel and iron rivets used on the Titanic. Using a hydraulic press, they repeatedly simulated the pressure on the ship's steel plates. After extensive experiments, Dr. Hooper reached some important conclusions. Testing revealed that the strength of grade 4 steel and grade 3 steel under pressure was nearly identical. However, grade 3 steel was easier to install, making it a practical choice at the time. Given the rush to complete the Titanic, using grade 3 steel was fully compliant with technical standards of the era. But then came a critical discovery. When the team froze both grades of steel to replicate the frigid temperatures during the Titanic's voyage, a significant difference emerged. Grade 3 steel became much more brittle and prone to breaking. When the hull struck the iceberg, the brittle rivets snapped, creating a big gap in the steel plate connections. This is the real reason the Titanic sank. Contrary to the popular belief that the iceberg directly tore through the hull's steel plates, it was the failure of the rivets under freezing conditions that led to the disaster. Dr. Hooper explained that if the Titanic had been constructed entirely with grade 4 steel rivets, the ship would not have sunk as quickly. This could have provided enough time for rescue operations to save more lives. But why were there inferior iron rivets in the first place? After further research, it was discovered that the impurities in the iron rivets weren't due to poor quality, but were intentionally added, specifically carbon powder. At the time, hydraulic technology was limited. While hydraulic presses could easily install rivets on flat steel plates, the curved and uneven surfaces at the bow posed a challenge. Hydraulic presses couldn't be used there, and the rivets had to be installed manually. This created a problem. The strength of both grade 3 and grade 4 steel rivets was too high for workers to install by hand. As a result, they opted for softer iron rivets, which were easier to work with. However, iron rivets lacked sufficient compressive strength. To compensate, carbon powder was added to enhance the strength of the iron rivets. However, the technical workers at the time overlooked the effects of low temperatures. While adding carbon powder to the iron rivets did increase their strength, it also made them more brittle in cold conditions. In the freezing temperatures of the North Atlantic, these rivets became prone to breaking, which caused larger gaps to form in the hull. As a result, water flooded in more quickly. In 2009, Dr. Donald Murphy, a chief scientist from the International Ice Patrol, identified a second major factor contributing to the Titanic's sinking: the unusual climate conditions of 1912. That year, a rare astronomical event occurred. The Moon was at its closest point to the Sun in 1,400 years. This alignment caused the gravitational pull on ocean tides to increase by 74%. Furthermore, just days before the Titanic sank, the Earth reached its point of highest gravitational force from the Sun. As a result, the Titanic found itself in the midst of a 1,000-year tide. Under normal circumstances, icebergs drifting south from the Arctic would have been stranded on the Grand Banks near the Labrador Sea. The captain, based on his experience, had adjusted the Titanic's route south twice, believing it was in a safe zone. What he didn't know was that the rare tidal forces had allowed these massive icebergs to drift farther south, directly into the ship's path. Dr. Donald Murphy also explained that even with these tidal shifts, icebergs in the region wouldn't normally pose a danger because the Mexican warm current, averaging 15 to 18 degrees Celsius, would typically melt them within 10 days. However, 1912 was also an exceptionally warm winter, the warmest in a century. This anomaly caused the Mexican warm current to shift southward, allowing icebergs to invade the southern route taken by the Titanic. This matched the 7 iceberg warnings the ship received on April 14th. The captain was aware he had entered iceberg territory, so why didn't he slow down? There were 2 reasons. First, at a later inquiry, Ismay admitted he wanted to reach the United States quickly to secure the Blue Riband Award for the fastest Atlantic crossing. Second, The navigation rules of the time advised speeding up when encountering a group of icebergs to pass through them more quickly, rather than slowing down to avoid them. While this was standard practice at the time, the Titanic tragedy prompted a re-evaluation of these navigation policies. This is the truth behind the Titanic tragedy, a culmination of multiple factors that led to its downfall. At the final hearing, no one was held accountable. Neither Ismay from White Star Line, the surviving sailor on lookout duty, nor the telegraph operator faced any blame for the disaster. The RV Canoe, the research vessel that discovered the Titanic's wreckage, was officially retired in 2014, concluding its distinguished 44-year career. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more content. If you have any topics you'd like me to cover, please comment below and see you in the next one.